we're going to talk all about bass guitar with my good friend Jesse Eigen.
Hello.
Let's talk about one of our favourite bass players, Paul McCartney.
Oh, yes.
Paul McCartney does a whole other thing, and he's really melodic in his approach to playing bass. Talk a little bit about how we might be able to incorporate a little bit of that, into a song, for instance.
Yeah. So with Paul McCartney, I think a lot of it is the tone. So he plays the Hofner basses, which are, I've got a very particular kind of woody, muffled sound, but still very punchy, very present. If I was going to try and emulate that on this bass, I would actually probably take this out, and I'd roll the tone off, and I'd probably, because he uses a pick as well, and I would probably try and pluck closer to the neck to get that kind of like woody, let's see. So that in terms of the tone, and in terms of his approach, like you say, very, very melodic. Some of the stuff he plays on like Something, for example, or Penny Lane, it's absolutely unheard of to be that tasty and play that much within a song that has so much going on already. And he sings half of it as well at the same time.
It's quite something.
But yeah, I think
even like I Saw Her Standing There is a heck of a bass line. I mean,
100%. Yeah, it's just a great bass line.
Yeah.
Because he could have gone, well, she was just 17, you know what I mean. Then it would just be kind of boring.
Yeah.
But he's come up with that. And it's busy, but it's a really, really great bass line, and it's an ear hook, and it makes the song automatically.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's so cool. One thing, you've got this foam that we just took out the bass, and I think we should actually talk about that while we're here. So what are you doing with that, Jesse?
So the foam thing originated with the likes of James Jamerson, Carol Kay, all the Motown recordings. Jamerson, by the way, let's bow down to him for a minute.
Yeah.
Because he probably is my biggest influence, I would say, on the bass. But so the foam basically acts as a mute, and it mutes the strings from resonating out too much, and it kind of gives it that punchy, kind of muffled thing you hear on the Motown.
So like you're putting that equivalent right by the strings here, aren't you?
I'm putting it right by the strings, yeah. So I've got this little ashtray cover here, which I pop it into, because I think if it's too far down towards the pickup, it gets too muted.
And it can also affect the intonation as well, a little bit.
It can a little bit, yeah. Like you find that your open string might be a little bit sharp. If I'm playing up here, for example. See, that doesn't resonate for ages. It kind of just gives it the right amount of sustain that was really, really apt for the whole Motown bounce. And
that's such a great trick that you can do to your bass at home. All you need is a bit of any sort of...
Yeah, exactly. Especially with P basses, for example, which are very warm, sit in the mix really well. If you haven't got that, there's actually a technique that I've been using recently, and I know has also been popularized by Danny Morris, who I think is a lecturer at Berkeley, and he's well into his Motown as well. But basically the technique is a left-hand technique, and what you do is you pluck the note that you want with your index finger, but you're actually using your pinky to mute. And even though it kind of affects your mobility on the neck a little bit, it's a really, really handy technique if you want to... as opposed to...
So what you're doing there is you're literally your pinky finger is just touching the string very gently.
My pinky is touching ever so slightly. It makes for some interesting movements on the neck because you can really only kind of keep that one shape. essentially does the same thing.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah. So if you haven't got foam, you could always try that. It takes a little bit of time to kind of get to grips with it. But yeah, that's a lot of because sometimes people see me play and go, "You're not moving your left hand." I'm like, well, if I want to get that sound, and I haven't got the foam, then that's a handy technique as well.
What about tunings, Jesse? What do you? I mean, the bass is tuned E, A, D, G.
Mm-hmm.
What do you go much away from that when you're doing stuff?
I don't move away from that too much. If I'm on a gig that requires lower notes, I'll usually use my 5-string, which is that bass in the background there. Or I've got a 4-string jazz as well that's got...
Oh, the hip shot thing.
That one, yeah. So it's basically like a little switch.
Yeah, a little lever that drops it down to a D.
Yeah,
that's amazing. I think we should talk about the P bass because it's probably the most recorded bass in history.
Yeah.
And yet it's a very simple... It's a single pickup bass, although it's 2 smaller pickups. Let's just have a look. This is an early 70s P bass, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is a 73 P bass. For people who don't know the background of the P basses, it was the first electric bass that Leo Fender invented. The idea, I think, was to follow on from the double bass. So they were trying to make the double bass an electric instrument. Flip it that way.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, they pretty much got it right the first time.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty classic design. It's got a split coil pickup. These are all the original electronics from the 70s. Just the one volume and tone knob. Very simple. So just master volume and then tone. I was never a P-bass guy until about 5 years ago, I'd say. I was like, because I think I grew up listening to Jocko and Flea and all the flashy guys, and I was like, P-bass, that's for whatever, it's who wants all that mid-range in their basses.
Because I think for this video, the whole fretless bass Jacko thing, that's a whole other video. That's a whole other minefield.
It really is, yeah. I mean, we can talk about that tone a little bit maybe after with the jazz bass. But I think the penny really started to drop for me when I saw people like Pino and listened to the recordings, and when Voodoo came out, D'Angelo's record, you listen to that and you're like, what is that beautiful thing that just sits right in the mix where it should be? Yeah. And then the more I got into Motown and soul, I was like, okay, so the P bass is the bass that's been recorded the most in history, and there must be a reason for that. And then once you get into recording, you realize that straight out the box, 9 times out of 10, this is the tone that sits right where you want it in the mix.
Because that's the thing as well, as a producer and an engineer yourself as well, it's really tough to get a big complex bass sound to fit properly into a mix without much, without the EQing and stuff like that. And for some reason, just the pureness of the tone, P basses just have a sound that just sits so comfortably with a drum kit and a record.
It's like it's not the most exciting tone on its own.
No.
When you're playing, you're like, oh, that's a bit dull. It's a bit mid-rangey. Like I think when people play jazz bass, it's quite exciting. If you hear it on its own. But then as soon as you pop it in the mix, it magically just loses that honkiness, and that low mid-range just sits perfectly.
And you can turn it up louder in the mix, and it still sounds great, and the notes come through, but it doesn't sound harsh or...
Yeah, and that's why I think it's a favorite with producers, and if you pull this out on a session, there's like a big sigh of relief.
Yeah.
In the room,
I think we can talk about a few things that you've done to this bass, or more accurately, how you control this bass. One thing is the Flatwound Strings.
Yeah.
Because that makes a big... I love Flatwound Strings. Flatwound Strings, for those of you who aren't familiar, most basses come with round wound strings. Mm-hmm. And flatwound strings are, well, by nature, flat. They're smooth. So the burrs are knocked off the windings. So they're a lot smoother to the touch, and they produce a more dull sound. Is that, I'm pretty close.
Yeah, I think they're generally less zingy, than round strings, warmer, I think people would say.
Yeah. The thing I noticed as well is, for a guy who doesn't have the best bass technique in the world, there's a lot less, because with a set of round ones, there's a lot of string noise. Correct, so as you're playing a bass line, there's a lot of that.
Get all that string,
whereas with flats, you don't really get that at all, do you? It's a very smooth sound. It's more like a double bass, so they
exactly.
Flatwounds. Using the tone knob on a P bass is a big deal as well, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'll rarely have the tone open full because I don't really like the... There's a bit too much attack for my taste there, so I'll usually probably roll it off about halfway. It allows me to dig in a little bit more without getting in the way with all that zinginess and high end. If you're trying to emulate, for example, James Jamerson's tone of the Motown thing, like that was quite closed off. If you hear the isolated bass tracks, it was very much like... But then again, when you put that in the mix, it just gives it that really big, fat, low end without getting in the way of the vocal or the guitars or the horns or anything else that's going on.
That's so cool. Well, I think we should maybe go and have a look at some more kind of modern stuff. We've got a 5-string bass as well behind us, so let's go and get that out and have a little look at what we might want to do with that.
Let's do it. So this is a Fender jazz bass. This is called the Elite model. It's got an active circuitry in it, which means that it's got an onboard preamp.
Yeah.
And you can alter the tone. So you got bass, mid, treble knobs, as well as volume and pickup blend. So we've got an active passive switch. So this is passive mode. And then kicking the preamp. So obviously much louder, much more present, a bit more zingy. And you've got control over your EQ as well, which is nice.
So this is what we would call a much more it's a much more modern bass design, isn't it?
Yeah, 100% more modern. Yeah, you'll see it on a lot of pop gigs, gospel stuff. But yeah, in difference to the P bass, so this pickup configuration is 2 single coil pickups, in what's called the J configuration, the jazz configuration. So we've got one pickup which is further back towards the bridge, which will, if I just solo that pickup now, it'll give you that kind of very mid-rangey Jocko. So that sound of pickup that people usually associate with like Jaco Pastorius, for example. And then if I blend that over towards the neck pickup, it's a bit more woolly, a bit more warm. So not quite a P bass, but still got those qualities of being a bit more subby. Usually I'll just play them balanced in series, which gives you that classic jazz bass sound. Now at the minute I've got the active circuitry engaged with the EQ, and I think I've got a little bit of mid-range dipping out, so if I put that back on flat,
powerful,
that mid-range growl back in there.
When would you use this bass over your old P bass?
If the track's got a modern feel, if it needs, a lot of the time it's the producer's call as well, because I think choosing the right instrument gets you halfway there to begin with. If you're playing the right part on the wrong instrument, I don't think anyone will ever be happy,
Absolutely.
With the tone. So I actually just recorded a track for an Israeli artist actually where we started off on the P bass and we weren't quite feeling it, and I went, hold on, like, are you after a modern sound for this track? And he said yes. I was like, okay. So pull this one out, play the same exact part, and they were like, snap, there's a sound.
Perfect.
Because this really, really does cut through the mix, because that mid-range can be really, really prominent. But it's obviously got a nice full low end as well.
And you've got so many tonal kind of choices. Active, for those of you who aren't familiar with what active instruments are, basically means you've got a battery in this instrument.
Yes, so there's a battery compartment right in there. We open that up, that takes a 9-volt battery, possibly 2 even. I'm not sure.
Yeah, some batteries.
Yeah, some batteries which power the active circuitry.
And a couple of other things on this bass, of course, strings, A, there's more of them, and B, they're round wound. So let's talk about the 5-string bass thing, Jesse. So this is a 5-string bass, and your low string is tuned down to a B, is that right?
Yeah, it's tuned down to a B, so it gives me extended range below the standard low E. tuning down to a B. So this bass very clean B string. So very popular in gospel, a lot of pop, some rock stuff as well, you know, where people go down to drop tunings.
It's even handy if you're in the key of D and need that low note. It saves you dropping
Exactly.
And also you're using round strings on this, so it gives you a much more different, kind of more sustain, much more presence with the instrument as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot brighter, quite zingy, you know, up top with a... You wouldn't get that from a P bass with rounds.
Also, Jesse, I noticed you've got this thing, the string mute at the top. Tell us a little bit about how you're using, or why you're using that.
So with this being a 5-string bass, sometimes it's a bit more difficult to keep the strings from ringing out that you're not playing. So if I'm playing up here, for example, so this string mute here actually saves me from having to mute each, you know, like my low B string, for example, doesn't ring out and just keeps the sound a lot cleaner. And cause sometimes you can get a bit of rumble, you don't even notice it's happening. So this, I think it's Groove Gear who make this one. Between these two basses, you will have all the tones covered. You know, there's some things that this can do that the P bass can't do, some things that P bass can do that this can't do. And I think between those two, you pretty much won't find yourself without a tone that is right for a specific song. And
actually, that is a really good point. If you are wanting to get into playing bass or just want a bass to play in the studio, do you recommend any more kind of budget-friendly models or anything like that, Jesse?
Yeah, sure. So obviously Fender, they're usually my go-to basses, but they make a really varied range of instruments, you know, from their Mexican-made models, which are great, which are a bit more budget-friendly, to the Squires that are great instruments to begin on. I think in terms of actual playability, the jazz bass necks are a little bit slimmer. So if you're just starting out and you haven't quite got the stretch yet, or you're still getting used to the technique, a jazz bass might be a better model to start on just because it's a bit easier to get around the neck, whereas P basses, they can be quite chunky necks. You've also got short scale basses.
Yeah, we can look at that other bass that you brought in the other video as well. So
that's a short scale bass, for example, and that one is it's a shorter neck basically. It's a shorter scale, so it's smaller. It's close to the size of a guitar if someone's moving from guitar to bass.
While we're talking about short scale basses, actually, you guys should go and check, if you're interested in basses, you should go and check out my good friend Scott Whitley and his YouTube channel. He talks all about basses, and he has his own range actually of short scale Chowney basses. They look a little bit like an alembic kind of vibe, but really playable, great instruments, and budget friendly as well. So big shout out to Scott. All the resources on YouTube, you've got Leland Sklar, of course, iconic.
Gosh, yeah, it's endless. I mean, Lee's channel is great because his whole philosophy about music, about bass, about life in general is really, really informative and entertaining.
Be more like Lee.
Exactly, yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. And where can we find you online as well, Jesse, for those wanting to go and check you out online?
My website, jesseeigen.com. Instagram, same again, just Jesse Eigen.
Yeah. And you offer remote recording so people can send your tracks and have Jesse play on them. And also you were saying about a specific thing to do with that bass as well that you have available as well, a sample pack?
Oh, yeah. So I actually sampled that bass from head to toe. Took me a while, different velocities, and basically just made a virtual instrument out of that. And that sample pack can be purchased on my website as well. There's some free loops there, some free bass loops you can use, different tempos and things you can sample, and pull it into your DAW onto your keyboard and just have a 73 P bass at your fingertips. So cool.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Jesse. This has been
Thank
great.
you for having me.
I'd love it if you would consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, all that good stuff. Ring the bell icon. It will let you know when I release new videos, which I do every single week. Stay safe out there, guys. I'll see you soon.
Bye.